2005, for the first time after years of intense conceptualization, a massive shift in the gaming industry was about to take place. Will Wright, co-founder of Maxis and the creative genius behind The Sims and SimCity, took to the stage at GDC for a talk that no one saw coming that would forever change the future of video games as we know them, even to this day. Because it was on this panel that the world got its first glimpses into what at the time looked like the greatest game ever made. A game where you not only got to create massive armies and forge galactic war, but a title where this all began from humble beginnings, creating your character as an amoeba in the soup of the atoms of life. Spore was finally unveiled for the world to see. A title that promised players a sandbox unlike anything we had seen before. And along the way, this would include things like full freedom and customization of your creatures and factions, sophisticated AI, and systems that would realistically react to the player, and essentially a transformation into a completely new game type every time you advance to a new era. The scope was unlike anything the industry had seen before, and because of that, so was the hype behind its release then years away. But how in the world could the minds at Maxis pull something like this off, especially in a world that was decades away from the more modern toolsets we have now, like Unreal Engine 5 with nanite environments? Well, the answer came down to two words. Words that nowadays spell cause for concern and worry, but at the time were beacons of hope to lead the gaming industry into a bright new future. Procedural generation. You see, in order to accomplish its lofty intentions, Spore centered around the idea of randomly generated content. Entire worlds and galaxies that would have had to have been handcrafted before were instead brought to life through the mathematics of heuristics and algorithms. Complex creatures could be sculpted from base presets of clay, and no matter how strange or otherworldly you made them, animations would spawn from deterministic and procedural checks to make everything feel right. Entire buildings and vehicles would be developed based on just small amounts of player input to fill in entire spaces to make your civilization feel grand. And every planet was able to cover massive amounts of space due to the terrain being procedurally generated, with mountains, oceans, plains, and other features. And because of all of this groundbreaking tech behind the game, the promise became that it would provide an endless amount of content unlike anything we'd ever seen, and a sense of scale that had only been dreamed of in the days of Pac-Man. Spore was set to be a game that would make every other game obsolete. But you see, the reason you don't hear about this game much nowadays is because the heroic and inspiring story of Spore ends right there. When it came time for the game to release in 2008, it felt like the world came crashing down just as fast as the hype was drummed up. The complexity in so many promised features suddenly were revealed to be bare bones or lacking. The creation tools and procedural generation quickly became samey, as the AI for almost every creature felt the same, and while the variety was cool, all of it felt so hollow. Having an entire planet and galaxy with a huge custom-made civilization sounded fun until you realized all of the planets were exactly the same, all of the gameplay mechanics were trivial, and every single creature you made looked like a nightmare-fueled induced LSD trip gone bad. It was clear that Maxis had bit off more than they could chew, and procedural generation, a technology that seemed like a set of keys into the future, actually proved to be everything that made Spore so badly received. Funnily enough though, I never forgot the promises of Spore, and even more amazingly, to this day I look back on my time with it so fondly, because Spore, unlike so many other games out there, was truly innovative, and set its goals on something more lofty and interesting than just good gameplay and a good story. It set out to make us all dreamers. And that's why even to this day, I still adore this failed game, because it still managed to capture my imagination unlike so many other things out there. And isn't that what we play games for in the first place? But sadly, ever since then, especially as of late, it seems like every game has tried to use this tech only to meet the same pitfalls. Notably, recent titles like No Man's Sky promised once again entire galaxies to explore, but on release were met with harsh and memorable criticism due to the lack of heart, soul, and human touch in the content, resulting in gameplay loops and open worlds that were so boring to actually engage with that feel like a waste of time and space, since more than half of these universes are nothing more than randomly placed rocks. For all the pain and problems that procedural generation, and artificial intelligence for that matter have caused this industry, for all the negativity around these new sets of technology, I actually think that they also might just be the solution to how we make the next leap forward in an industry I love. Because despite the failures of Spore, No Man's Sky, or so many other recent games, I think it's only now that we are so close to finally solving this elusive puzzle that will reveal to the world why procedural generation and artificial intelligence in games is maybe the greatest thing that can happen for their future. So today, I'm going to break down exactly why and how I think procedural generation can be used in games to make them even better, and the utterly incorrect ways in which it's being utilized now. But to start, if I'm going to show you how procedural generation is so good, first I'll need to explain why it's so bad right now, by showing you how the adverse, handcrafted content is already so loved. One of the most talked about games I always see mentioned on my channel has to be The Outer Wilds. It's a game that I personally have a lot to say about, most of which isn't too popular with the gaming community, but overall, Outer Wilds is so beloved and well known for one reason and one reason alone: the utter care and attention that was put into this world, all handcrafted. You see, in the game, every day you awake to find yourself in a universe teetering on the edge of destruction, with only 22 minutes to figure out, well, everything. The keys and secrets to the universe, and why the sun keeps going supernova over and over, killing you, only for you to awake again in the same spot, stuck in a time loop. However, the real genius here stems from the thoroughly captivating sense of wonder you get playing. As you ignite your engines traveling from one planet to the next, you are met with countless fascinating and mysterious endeavors. Like rocks that disappear the second you look away due to quantum entanglement, massive cylinders of sand reaching up from a planet's surface and traveling across space itself towards another planet, or ancient alien structures being swallowed whole by massive black holes forming at the center of a planet's crust. Each and every one of these planets, full of so many unforgettable moments, are so memorable entirely because of the designers behind them. And every step you take in this game, every new secret you uncover, helps to unwrap this elusive puzzle just a little bit more. It's a perfect example of meaningful handcrafted content at its best, and it shows why people tend to like experiences similar to this as opposed to soulless procedural generation. Imagine if in the Outer Wilds every planet was completely random. Imagine if as you walked across each surface looking for secrets, you were met with nothing but the same copy-pasted things over and over, always waiting until you could get to the good stuff again. But no matter where you turn in the Outer Wilds, everything is new and interesting. Everything has a strict purpose whose main goal is in service of the feeling and the story that was being told. And because of this, you never feel like the game is wasting your time. Every single thing you do was thought through and considered. And while the journey to unlocking the main ending is much more linear than the game wants you to think, and is also the reason I prefer much more open experiences like Prey from Arcane, you still can't deny that at its heart, Outer Wilds accomplished what it set out to do, making a game that would last in our hearts forever. And almost every game that has done this before managed to do so because it focused so much on each moment in the experience. I'll never forget the first time when I was playing Outer Wilds and I landed on a comet covered in ice, for example, looking for secrets at its center. But confused on how to find a way in, I stumbled through the rock, hurtling through space for minutes, coming up with a plan. That was until the comet's path began to come closer into contact with the sun, and the ice began to melt away as I fell into the inner cave network of the comet and made my way through endless caverns to find one of the coolest reveals in the entire game. Things like this only happen when everything comes together: the music, the exploration and mystery, or the gameplay loop that got you there in the first place. And the only way things like this come together so perfectly all at once is when crafted by human beings with an undying love for the product, not just algorithms and heuristics. Because no matter how good a set of procedural generation is, it can't replace the love and care, the human touch that makes art beautiful. Or at least, That's what most people would say. Because for most people, that's true. For instance, a lot of players' favorite part of every FromSoft game are the special moments that you can figure out for yourself, like meeting the ancestral spirit in Elden Ring for the first time, or stumbling upon Ash Lake in Dark Souls and being in awe at the horror before you. These small but purposeful set pieces that the developer wanted you to see leave such an impact because that's what they were designed to do. It's the secret behind why handcrafted content is great. It's human beings making stuff they find awesome for other human beings, no robot in the middle. But you see, for me, I actually think it goes a lot deeper than this, because I think the real truth is how good procedural generation can be, and even more so, just how impactful and great it could make future games as well. And a big reason for that is many developers aren't even using procedural generation correctly now. But if they did, they could make the dreams we all have as kids for things like Spore finally come true. Those same feelings and memories we get from handcrafted games can be replicated just as, if not better, in procedurally generated games too. So now, let's talk about how that can happen exactly though, by first looking into some recent examples I really love. For any of you that have gotten the chance to play Valheim or Deep Rock Galactic, you know each of them has a ton of major selling points going for them. But maybe the most interesting out of all of those is a simple one. They never end. And depending on who you are, that either sounds like the best or worst thing ever. And even though I tend to fall into the latter camp, so much so that I recently made a video about why I think most modern games should be shorter and they waste our time, in the case of Valheim and Deep Rock, I actually really like it. However, that begs the question, why do I like the procedural generation and never-ending maps and combinations or permutations in Valheim or Deep Rock, but despise the likes of it in, say, Elite Dangerous? Well, first of all, in the case of Valheim and Deep Rock Galactic, the games were made from the ground up with procedural content in mind. It's intrinsic to what makes the experience great. For example, in Valheim, generating a new map for the first time and finding yourself in a forest that looks very familiar while feeling brand new at the same time ignites that sense of adventure in all of us, and is a key reason that the game feels so fun to play even hundreds of hours later. In fact, even the idea of not knowing what you will find out there becomes so engaging every time, because the gameplay mechanics and flow were tailor-built knowing this would be a key feature of the game, procedural generation. And it means every time you are dropped off from that giant bird in your starting area, you know that despite the lack of handcrafted nature at every single step in the world, it will still be so worth your time getting lost in it because there still is a sense of magic out there. In Deep Rock Galactic, drilling deep into the planet's crust at the start of each mission is exhilarating because you know you will be met with an environment whose layout you likely have never seen before exactly. And this unfamiliarity and originality in the content keeps things fresh, so much so that many players have been able to put in hundreds of hours into these games and still look back on them so fondly. But to clarify, this only works because the games themselves justify these features. In Valheim, even simple things like building a house or crafting takes a lot of time and effort, and this means a key part of the game is the suffering you must endure to get there. By figuring out the layout of the map around you and what resources you have at your disposal and making the most out of it. The game being different every time becomes crucial to how the game actually works and why it's fun in the first place. It's the same principle that keeps Minecraft fun, for instance. I mean, think about it. Even though you've probably made a basic house in Minecraft that looks exactly the same at the start of the game a billion times, it's the fact that the environment around you is just a tad different that makes it continually engaging. When procedural systems in map and content generation are used in ways like this, it becomes actually engaging because rather than the game and its meaning focusing solely on the procedural content, instead the meat of what makes them great, crafting, surviving, building, and a big sandbox to experiment with, are all handcrafted elements which press and weigh against the procedural systems, keeping you on your toes. Procedural content and artificial intelligence in games shouldn't be the main course, but rather the waiter shuffling in each dish between meals. In a game like Elite Dangerous, because of the ambition to simulate the Milky Way galaxy one-to-one, a copious amount of procedural generation was used to craft what amounts to a very boring and barren galaxy, which sure is grand and interesting in scope, but in actual practice is as devoid and lifeless as the actual universe itself seems to be. Simply flying between one space station to the next isn't interesting when so much of that architecture looks the same, or when the gameplay loop entirely consists of staring at a screen in warp drive for 2 real in-world hours. Valheim, by contrast, feels so alive because every element is so vibrant and purposeful. For instance, while the world in Valheim is procedurally generated too, the algorithm which defines each seed is anything but fully random or boring. You always start in what is called the meadows, where somewhere nearby there will likely lie a more imposing black forest biome, and as you venture further and further out in any radial pattern, you will come across more and more interesting and difficult zones like the snowy mountaintops, the vast ocean full of monsters, or the harrowing ash and mistlands full of secrets. So while the game is technically procedurally generated, it still has a true feeling of handcrafted care as well, where rather than taking away from all the good stuff, the procedural generation merely keeps it interesting with small deviations in layout, while still maintaining the pacing, the art that handcrafted designers and real people put their full intentions into. And another perfect exemplification of this are all of the most popular Bethesda games of all time. Think Skyrim, Oblivion, Fallout 3, or Morrowind, all games that are lauded as classics in the games industry primarily for their use of amazing, handcrafted quests, mods, and worlds. But did you know that basically all of these universes are actually in large part procedural? Entire fantasy worlds like Cyrodiil from Oblivion were actually completely generated from computers, and then combed over by hand from artists to touch up and add content. And with all of these entries, players raved and gushed at the time of release because of how alive and handcrafted the worlds felt, when in reality, it was simply passionate artists and designers painting over a soulless robotic canvas. But you see, that's because it's only with the special touch from developers that things start to actually become good. It's not a case of procedural generation in games being good or bad, it's a case of how you use the tool for the job. And it's one of the main reasons I feel so sad when I hear people complain about procedural generation in games, because it's a developer and design problem, not a technological one. I mean, look at another Bethesda title like Daggerfall, which is almost entirely procedural, and because of that, maybe one of the worst entries in the entire Elder Scrolls series. Sure, there is literally more landmass in that game than all other Bethesda titles combined, but when that landmass is full of towns with the exact same sets of dialogue, NPCs, and houses, you can't help but ask, what's the point? And that's the real issue with procedural generation. It isn't about the tech, the artificial intelligence, or all of the proc gen and heuristics behind the scenes. It's about whether or not the design of the game was bad, not the tech. But you see, examples like this are only the tip of the iceberg. Because usually when people think of procedural generation or artificial intelligence in games, they are thinking of things I mentioned like Valheim, Minecraft, Elite Dangerous, or every roguelike game ever. The even more interesting examples are all over though, and give us a better picture into why and how these new forms of tech can be so revolutionary. Take for example, Middle-earth: Shadow of War. While the game includes a full-fledged campaign in the Lord of the Rings universe with a massive open world and countless quests, the real star of the show, and the one thing people talk about this game to this day, is the Nemesis system. It's an algorithmic-based feature for the series that procedurally generates orc adversaries that you can encounter in-game. But instead of just being one-and-done battles like most games, the things that happen during your fights, along with anything you said, all play a role in how the orcs evolve and how your game progresses. For example, you may be met with an especially mean orc who challenges you to battle, in which you vanquish him easily. But 2 hours later in game, suddenly this same orc's little brother will show up looking for vengeance with a small army at his side of other orcs who called him a friend. In other instances, specific things that happened in previous battles may be referenced. And on top of this, the entire system is built around a sort of hierarchical approach, where you can pin certain orcs against against one another or spread lies that break family ties and forge new alliances at the same time. And all of this results in no two players' games being quite the same, because even though the main narrative and story beats are similar, how you get there and what happens in this hierarchy of orcs along the way comes down entirely to the Nemesis system. It's a game that was built from the ground up to take advantage of procedural generation and artificial intelligence. On the fly as you play, orcs are crafted and tailored based on the decisions you make. And those same orcs will mold their own stories and personalities around how you treat them and others. And truthfully, it makes for such a fascinating world that really feels reactive, where even though a large majority of what you see and experience will be procedural and based off nothing more than math in a computer, it still all feels so great. But remember, at the heart of it is still the human touch that makes all art great. The lines that the orcs say are still voice acted, the dialogue had to be written, and the encounters in a more general sense have been thought through and designed. In essence, the Nemesis system serves more simply as a liaison serving us content that was handcrafted rather than being the actual content itself, a conductor rather than an orchestra member. The key to procedurally generated content in games that use artificial intelligence right now is they need the actual content made for them. So many developers and gamers right now see these new sets of technology as a way to make content which humans can then place or alter in whatever way they see fit. But that's the exact opposite of the way it should be done most of the time. As the tech stands right now, these systems work much better if they are the ones in the driver's seat, using a multitude of content crafted from real breathing people to then create a scene entirely from binary and numbers. Or in other words, current day procedural generation and artificial intelligence works much better as the game master constructing a puzzle with the pieces made by artists and designers, rather than the other way around, as most games use it now. And in fact, maybe one of the best examples of this actually being done correctly is a game now almost 2 decades old, Left 4 Dead 2. In Left 4 Dead 2, a lot of people don't even know this, but it uses what is called the Coordinator, an AI-driven director of sorts that dynamically controls gameplay on the fly in each session. It will adjust difficulty and pacing depending on a player's performance, or even spawn or remove entire enemies, encounters, items, or obstacles based on what players are doing, all in an effort to tailor-make an experience that feels great at all times with immaculate pacing. And for any of you who have actually played Left 4 Dead 2, you know how amazing it feels moment to moment. There's a reason over a decade later this game still sees so much support, and also why it still reigns supreme over more modern entries like Back 4 Blood. Because no amount of graphics or modern RPG elements can make up for an artificial intelligence system that was pulled off as well as Valve did in Left 4 Dead 2. On top of really awesome physics and gameplay too, to be fair. But once again, that goes back to the idea that the best examples of artificial intelligence and procedural generation are coming from systems that take puzzle pieces and just put them together. All the guns, enemies, and ways to actually play the game in Left 4 Dead 2 were handmade and designed thoroughly. The surprising part is that how you put those pieces together doesn't actually matter all that much. And even more so, computers tend to be really good at that portion of puzzle solving specifically, managing to keep a game like Left 4 Dead 2 fresh and interesting for much longer than, say, Back 4 Blood, despite the fact that the latter has so much more upgrades and builds to actually try and game. The thing is though, it's not just the gameplay where procedural generation and artificial intelligence can be so beneficial. It's even in things like the narrative. And the quintessential example of this, without a doubt, is Dwarf Fortress. Maybe one of the coolest and most unique games out there, this sprite and text-based adventure sees you controlling a band of dwarves trying to survive in the wilderness. But while the premise itself is simple, the actual game and antics you can get up to are anything but. Every time you start a new game, a world is procedurally generated along with a band of dwarves, each with their own sets of personalities, desires, and behaviors. And as you try to help these dwarves stumble their way into success, you are met with countless strange or awesome events, one after another. Like say a dwarf that may fall in love with a stray cat in your castle, after which he starts murdering any dwarf who even looks at the cute feline. Or what about another game where a player's fortress was overrun by a horde of rats due to non-stop breeding, after which he had to devise new ingenious ways to convince the dwarves to make new technology that could blow up thousands of rats at once. Insane and wacky stories like this only happen in-game because of the procedural generation and artificial intelligence behind it all. Introducing a cat or a rat to a dwarf doesn't mean these things have to happen, but rather, because of the deep systematic design behind the game, truly anything can happen whenever. Maybe one dwarf starts to make a lot of money for your empire, but the others start to get jealous and it causes an uprising. Maybe one of your favorite dwarves gets into a brawl randomly at the local pub because of events that took place long before. Memorable narratives like this that are so complex and deep, but even more so, extremely personal to the player and thus even more meaningful, can only happen when a game relies on its systems rather than purely handcrafted content. The amount of truly insane things that can happen in Dwarf Fortress are too much to actually design even for a team of thousands of developers in AAA or indie alike. But here, a team of just two brothers managed to make a game that tells extremely well-crafted and personal stories that even the biggest giants in RPGs in the industry can't. It's the perfect example of how procedural generation and artificial intelligence, along with a systems-first design approach, can be used to massively improve any game. And it's also why my favorite genre of games is immersive sims, especially Prey and Prey Mooncrash, because games like this and Dwarf Fortress rely entirely on designing systems and a world with rules and deep logic that players must discover and uncover themselves. I think the whole reason in the first place that so many people shudder and complain when they hear the words procedural generation or artificial intelligence in games is because the examples that come to their mind are worlds full of boring filler or half-baked systems that aren't actually fun to play with. Games that are made by developers trying to pad game time and add length to sell you a higher priced product instead of the technology actually being used to make a better product. Because when used correctly, with a systems-first design approach with full freedom, or by focusing on handcrafted content that is pieced together rather than the opposite, these technologies not only become interesting, but actually vital to making some of the most fascinating games out there, whether that be in the narrative or gameplay alike. And it's only now that I feel like we really are in the presence of something really special, where developers might finally be realizing how to utilize these new sets of technology properly, and players will have nothing left but to fall in love. Take for example the next upcoming game from legendary game creator Ken Levine, Judas. After almost a 10-year hiatus after the BioShock series, Ken only recently finally returned to unveil to the world for the first time his newest project. But regardless if this game turns out to be a smash hit like the original BioShock, it's the ideas behind it that have me excited. Not just about Judas, but for the future of the entire games industry. You see, back in 2014, Ken gave a talk at GDC about what he called narrative Legos. He described it as games whose stories could truly react to the player, where characters were not just vessels for you to learn about, but rather real people who also learned about you. Decisions you made would drastically affect the push and pull of a narrative. And if you decided to be an insane person and suddenly kill the main protagonist of the story helping to lead you to victory, well, the story would react accordingly and send the world into chaos. And in turn, really make you feel like you were a part of the action. You actually were the main character, not just by name, but by purpose. And to me, this is what the holy grail of games is all about. Truly reactive worlds that feel alive and fully realized. It's what separates games from, say, movies, television, books, or any other art form out there in the first place. Their ability to uniquely give us a sense of consequences for our actions, something only our real lives can do outside of them. But the struggle with this holy grail of sorts is that it seemingly is impossible to pull off. You can't account for absolutely any and everything a player will do. There simply isn't enough compute power to do that in a game, let alone the real world, and the technology just hasn't been there. But with procedural generation and artificial intelligence, we finally are getting close. You see, in Judas, the game doesn't have what many would call a traditional narrative. Instead, you awake to find yourself as a specific character trapped on a ship in space, discovering that you have done something very wrong. But what happens from this point onwards is entirely up to you, where you will have to decide which of 3 main characters to ally with, and at any moment you can oscillate between each of them as they vie for your attention and help. And with each decision you make in game, an AI coordinator behind the scenes is at every moment crafting the experience before you one step ahead. Entire rooms and environments will change and mold to fit the story that you bring forth, and characters' personalities and stories will bend and twist to the wills of not only your character, but you, the player. Because the key selling point of Judas is that finally, for the first time, at least what it's promising, is you are the main character. Not Kratos, not Master Chief with you behind the controller, but really you. Your personality, your decisions will completely change the story and world before you, culminating in an experience and narrative that you can truly call your own. And want to know what the best part is? It alleviates the concerns of how shallow this could be by doing what all games like this attempting to pull this off, at least at this point in time, should do. All of the environments, enemies, dialogue, voice acting, and story is handcrafted, but the AI coordinator simply places and alters all of these sections like puzzle pieces, aiming to craft a narrative that will bend to anything we throw at it. And the thing is, regardless of how well this actually is pulled off in the end, I don't think it actually matters all that much. What really matters is that finally we are converging on a path that will eventually show why procedural generation in games can and will be so great, by taking the lessons we have learned from so many titles before and doing the best we can now. But you see, there actually is just one more specific game we need to talk about that explains my points better than any other could out there. A game that has been met with unending and depressing criticism and disdain from across the internet, myself included, but also one that I feel is beyond misunderstood, with people focusing on all the wrong things as to why it's bad, while at the same time dismissing all the potential it actually has despite its shortcomings. A game that beyond a shadow of a doubt is everything wrong with procedural generation, but strangely, also at the same time, an amazing case study into how to actually do it right, too. Starfield. You know what annoys me even more than how much I was disappointed by Starfield after playing on its release? It's how much more disappointed I am watching people try to explain why this game is bad. I've watched countless videos now on this lambasted title, and in each one, I feel like everyone is correctly identifying the game has issues and can be boring or feel pointless to play, but they aren't correctly identifying the key issues of why that is. I've heard over and over, for instance, how Starfield is bad because of the endless loading screens, the inability to fly from space to the planet's surface directly, the weird facial animations, the bad water textures, small cities, or barren and lifeless planets full of walking and no super fast vehicles. But the thing is, none of this actually matters. Sure, flying from space to a planet's surface would be surreal and amazing. I've played No Man's Sky and Star Citizen, and I love it there. Sure, the dated character animations and dialogue minigame is strange when you compare it to, say, Cyberpunk, and yes, the combat is just not quite good enough when compared to contemporaries. However, do you know what other games had all these issues on their release? Skyrim, Oblivion, Morrowind, Fallout 3 and 4, and so on and so on. Issues like this have always permeated Bethesda games, and they sold and reviewed just fine. And in fact, even more damning, you can go back and play these games right now, and they still have a sense of magic to them that is hard to describe. It wasn't just an artifact of the time. The actual issue with Starfield isn't any of the tech. It isn't the engine limitations of the Creation Engine versus Unreal, or the copious use of procedural generation that produces barren planets with no actually interesting places to explore. The real problem is the core of the art and design behind all of it is so soulless. And nowhere is this more immediately evident than the unbelievable potential of procedural generation in this game and the monumental disaster it became instead. Every planet you land on in Starfield is home to the exact same thing, a barren, empty wasteland, with a different color palette and a couple random encounters and events. And sure, there are a handful of unique places to see like the Red Mile or most of the major cities, but for the most part, everywhere you explore in this game is nothing but endless miles of rocks waiting to be walked across, and bandit hideouts or science facilities that without exaggeration have the exact same layout over and over again. I mean, seriously, if I see another bandit encampment one more time, I am going to slap myself out of pure boredom. That's how I feel playing Starfield. But you see, the issue here isn't actually that the game is using the creation engine, or it's procedural, or that there's so many planets. It's actually that there isn't enough content behind them, and the content that is there is so hollow and devoid of true artistic mastery. I've heard over and over, for example, people exclaim that Starfield would have been better with 10 planets instead of 1,000. But my retort would be, how exactly? Take all of the content that is currently in the game and condense it down to 10 planets, and guess what that gives you? An even more lackluster game where every base and outpost is the same just as before, but with even lower color palettes and only 10 planets to walk across aimlessly this time. And even if you were to argue that 10 planets would have allowed them to make each planet much more unique and interesting, I would argue that no, that wouldn't be the case either. Even one planet with the ability to make zones across its entire surface would be too much. And in order to achieve even the lousy goal of one planet, procedural generation would not be crucial, but required, even with a team of thousands of developers. If you wanted Starfield to feel more handcrafted and cared for, the most you could ask for realistically would be a large zone on one planet, like say Skyrim, or multiple zones on different planets, like say the Outer Worlds. But neither of those matter, because that isn't what Starfield set out to be. That isn't what got people so excited about this new IP in the first place. The hype around Starfield centered around the idea of having that sense of Bethesda exploration in an entire universe this time, with a scale that would take our breath away. But even more interestingly, and contrary to most discussions I've seen on the game, there's no reason this couldn't have been pulled off with the current technology and the current engine and everything that's in the game now. Starfield already has thousands of planets. It has different biomes and topography. It has the procedural tech to pull off all the lofty goals it claimed it would. Sure, there would be some loading screens and you can't fly from space to planet, but that wouldn't actually matter if everything in the game was super fun and meaningful. The issue is that the content itself used to fill this world is so boring and bland. Imagine the exact same game, no changes to the planets or locations, but instead of random encounters always being the same or similar science outposts, it was hundreds, thousands of little side stories and new buildings. Imagine if instead of putting so much effort into faction quests that, while okay, had so much bad writing and pacing, all of the effort went into making countless little adventures and things to discover on each new planet. In fact, leave in the loading screens, the inability to fly from surface to space, and all the janky UI and dialogue mechanics. Leave all of those things everyone claims ruin the game in, but now include hundreds of memorable and lovable quests and stories, or things that last with us forever, like say Skyrim had. It baffles me that in a game with such a grand scale and vision, Bethesda tried to once again copy their formula from before. Why does this game have to have big faction quests? Why does the main story have to be 20 hours? Why do the cities have to have lots of NPCs that give random quests? Things like this make sense in the RPGs of old, but for the future, games defined by procedural generation and AI, and especially for a game built around the idea of exploring an entire universe, all of your effort should have gone into that. I mean, even the main narrative of the game lends itself to this so perfectly. And by the way, just heads up, I'm going to spoil just a little bit of the ending of Starfield, so turn away for 2 minutes if you want to. Because at the end of Starfield, you find out that there are multiple dimensions and universes, meaning you could reset the entire playing environment every time you beat the campaign. Every world would run through a new algorithm and produce a slightly different planet. Every NPC would have their voice modulated or altered in some way. An entire new quests and places to explore, all handcrafted by the Bethesda team but not yet pushed out by the procedural generation system in previous iterations, would open up. Imagine a Starfield where the entire gameplay loop was venturing out to a faraway planet and touching down to find 10 different random little handmade areas and side stories that truly were interesting. To me, this would have been vastly better than, say, even what Elder Scrolls or Fallout gave us, which were great experiences in their own right, but rigid in terms of structure, following a main quest and a bunch of side or faction content that's also pre-planned out without that true wonder that space provides. Starfield should have been 90% those amazing side pieces of content and just exploring around and discovering crazy new things on each planet, with a high focus on the writing, design, and gameplay effort going into all of these side things on random planets so that no matter where you went, something new and interesting was there to catch your eye. And if your complaint is that this sounds like too much work and is unrealistic, the game already has enough content to fill out something like this. It just isn't being used correctly, and also, to be fair, it's not written or designed in any meaningful way either. But there are quite literally hundreds of hours of things to do in Starfield, but all of it is boring and in faction or main quests along with some one-off designed locations. Imagine if all those years of effort in Starfield went instead into the procedural generation content instead, into creating those little puzzle pieces that the creation engine and procedural tech could have used to fill the void. And even more so, imagine how good that would have been for modding. The entire game could have relied around these little one-off quests and systems on each planet that would have been so easy to plug and play for modders, making the game what Todd Howard actually wanted, one that quite literally never ends and is always awesome. Starfield's issue isn't a technical one, like most people say. In fact, the tech behind it could have been utterly amazing for the ideas I just laid out. Even with the loading screens and lack of fluidity in movement, it would have still been fine if the core of the art was there. Because if the actual content, the art, the writing, the meaning, and the design behind it was all good and placed in a procedural system and focused in the right places, that would have been the Starfield that we truly all dreamed of in our heads when we think about going into outer space and seeing what's out there. But instead, it just became another example of why people hate procedural generation so much in games in the first place. Remember though, technology isn't ruining games. The ideas of how we implement it and use it are, but if we use it correctly, it could make them so much better too. But at the end of the day, procedural generation, like any game mechanic, or all things in life for that matter, has its ups and downs. On one hand, it has birthed some of the most frustrating and boring or mundane games out there, giving developers an excuse to make games so long, yet so lacking in meaningful content that's actually good and memorable. But on the other hand, it also is, in my opinion, a key factor in what could be the future of games that has me more excited than anything ever before. A future where entire universes can come alive and provide us with new ways to play and endless fun. Because truthfully, the real key to making a fun or memorable game is designing systems or encounters that really stick with us. And despite what you may hear from the naysayers online, procedural generation can do that too. It all just comes down to the algorithm and systems behind it that all make it happen. And while for now that means designing systems where all of the art is probably made by humans and then constructed and compiled by computers, maybe one day all of the art itself as well will find itself in the hands of computers. And as scary as that sounds, as I guess what you could call an artist myself, I welcome that future. Because at the end of the day, it's not about the person or the thing behind the art. It's about the intrinsic beauty in the object itself. If a computer can one day make YouTube videos, or make video games that truly inspire and help others better than any human can, who am I to be selfish enough to argue that I for some reason should be that person doing it instead? Procedural generation, artificial intelligence, all of it's scary, but also so awe-inspiring and exciting too, even if that means I would lose my job doing this here for you guys every single month. And that That's why I think it's one of the best things out there that could happen to games. And maybe it could make making games even cheaper and require less of a workforce to create things that are so beautiful that we all want to experience in the first place. Because let's be honest, most of you aren't buying games to fund developers' salaries. You're buying them because you want a truly beautiful experience. And if that can happen cheaper in the future because of procedural generation and artificial intelligence, that's where we should go. Games aren't about paying the higher-ups or the developers or making sure everyone has a high salary. It's about providing a quality product of art that we all love. And the same goes for my videos and anyone on YouTube or doing anything for that matter, by the way. But as always, thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate you taking the time to consume all of the content I make, and let me know down below what you guys think of things like procedural generation or artificial intelligence in games. Are you a fan? Do you hate it? And why? Because while I for sure have some strong opinions on all of this, I'm sure some of you didn't like some of my takes, I love hearing and understanding all sides to get a better perspective too. And that's why I like responding to so many comments, even the negative ones, because I think they provide valuable feedback on not only how I can grow as a person, but how anyone watching can really get a better understanding of all of the sides. But thank you all again for watching, and make sure to check out the links to my other social media if you want to support me more or see how I look and think in real life, or check out the membership program or subscribe if you want to help me make more and more content here. Until next time.